After diners eat oysters, the restaurant usually throws out the shells, but now some restaurants are donating them to help save the oceans.
For 17 years, Florida hauled 500,000 tons of discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processors and dumped them into Gulf waters near Cedar Key. To many people, it looked like a giant waste disposal operation disguised as conservation. Environmental groups objected. Fishermen warned it would damage the seafloor. Even some scientists privately feared the project could become an expensive embarrassment. Could a pile of discarded shells really bring a dying ecosystem back to life? Or was Florida about to make one of the biggest environmental mistakes in its history? This is the story of the incredible transformation of the ocean. The plan nobody believed. Florida had a big problem, and it was growing bigger every single year. Long ago, the Gulf had been full of natural oyster reefs. Over time, those reefs had nearly disappeared. Pollution, overfishing, and development had worn them away until almost nothing was left. Then a small group of marine scientists had a different idea. Restaurants and seafood shops were throwing away enormous amounts of oyster shells. Truckload after truckload of shells was being hauled off to landfills where they just sat doing nothing. What if those shells were not garbage at all? What if they could be put back into the Gulf of Mexico, where oysters once lived in great healthy numbers? The scientists believed that putting old shells back on the seafloor could give young oysters a place to grow. Oysters need something hard to attach to when they are babies. Without a surface to grab onto, they drift away and die. The shells could be that surface. The shells could be the beginning of something new. Not everyone agreed. Some people said it was too risky. Others said it was too expensive. A few worried the shells might hurt the seafloor in ways nobody could predict. Even the scientists admitted they were not completely sure it would work. There were no promises and no easy answers. Still, over time, more than 500,000 tons of shells were carefully placed into the Gulf waters, spread across stretches of bare seafloor. And something began happening beneath the surface. It was quiet, invisible, and nobody could see it yet, but life was already stirring in the dark water below. The reef comes back to life. For a while, nothing seemed to happen. Boats passed overhead. The Gulf looked the same as always. People who had doubted the project started shaking their heads. Maybe it really was a waste of time and money. But deep below the surface, something extraordinary was already taking place. It started with creatures too small to see with the naked eye. Tiny microscopic organisms began landing on the shells and spreading across them like a thin, living blanket. This invisible layer of life was the first step. It was nature sending out a signal. Young oysters were drifting through the Gulf constantly, searching for somewhere solid to call home. When they found the shells, they grabbed hold and stayed. They were tinier than a grain of rice at first, but they grew fast. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The tiny oysters grew larger and harder, and they began producing babies of their own. As the oyster population grew, the reef started taking shape. Hard surfaces appeared where there had only been soft, empty mud before. Crabs arrived, picking their way carefully between the shells. Shrimp moved in, darting through the spaces and hiding from larger hunters. Small fish came next, weaving through the growing reef like they had always belonged there. What had once been a lifeless stretch of seafloor was becoming something alive and full of movement. The shells that restaurants had thrown away were now the foundation of a brand new underwater neighborhood. The project had started as a recycling idea. Now it was becoming something much more powerful, a living reef that nature was building on its own. But the real surprise was not happening on the reef itself. Scientists were starting to notice something strange happening in the water all around it. The Gulf begins to heal. Oysters are incredible animals. Most people think of them as food. But oysters do something remarkable that most people never think about. They filter water. Every single oyster pulls water into its body, traps tiny bits of dirt and pollution inside, and pushes clean water back out. One oyster can clean dozens of liters of water in a single day. Now imagine thousands and thousands of oysters working together hour after hour, day after day, without ever stopping. That is exactly what was happening in the Gulf. As the reef grew larger, the water around it became cleaner and clearer. Sunlight that had once been blocked by murky, polluted water was now reaching deeper into the Gulf than it had in years. And when sunlight reaches the seafloor, something wonderful happens. Seagrass begins to grow. Seagrass is a soft, gentle underwater plant that spreads across the seafloor in wide, green meadows. It is one of the most important habitats in the ocean. Sea turtles eat it. Young fish hide inside it. Shrimp and crabs rest in its roots. Without seagrass, many of those animals have nowhere safe to go. As the seagrass beds spread, more and more species returned to the area. The reef was feeding the seagrass, and the seagrass was feeding the animals, and the animals were making the whole ecosystem stronger. Everything was connected. Everything was working together in a way that no single scientist had planned or predicted. What had started as a simple idea, put the shells back in the water, had turned into something extraordinary. The Gulf was healing itself, piece by piece, creature by creature. But the biggest test was still coming. A powerful hurricane was building far out over the ocean and heading straight for the Florida coast. The storm that changed everything. Hurricanes are some of the most powerful storms on Earth. When one moves toward a coastline, it pushes enormous walls of water ahead of it. Those waves crash into beaches and shorelines with tremendous force, tearing away sand, soil, and anything else in their path. Coastal erosion from hurricanes can take years, sometimes decades, to recover from. When the hurricane finally reached the Florida coast, scientists were watching closely. They were worried about the reefs they had spent so many years building. Would the powerful waves destroy everything? Would the hard work of restoring the oyster beds simply be washed away in a single night? After the storm passed and the waters calmed, research teams went out to survey the damage. What they found was remarkable. In areas where the restored oyster reefs sat offshore, the coastline had held up significantly better than in areas without reefs. The reefs had acted like a natural shield. When the massive waves rolled in, they crashed into the hard reef structure first. That collision slowed the waves down and reduced their force before they ever reached the shore. Less energy reaching the beach meant less sand and soil torn away. The reefs had done something nobody had originally set out to achieve. They were protecting the land. Even more encouraging was what scientists found when they examined the reefs themselves. Despite the violence of the storm, the oysters had survived. In many places, the reef was already expanding further as new young oysters settled onto the storm-scattered shells and began growing. The project had survived its toughest test and proved something important. Healthy reefs do not just help the ocean, they help the people who live beside it too. Word of what had happened in Florida was spreading fast. Communities all along the coastline were beginning to ask the same question. Could this work for us too? A lesson from nature. The Florida project quietly became one of the most talked about success stories in marine restoration. Other regions began collecting oyster shells from local restaurants and seafood markets instead of dumping them in landfills. Shell recycling programs started popping up in dozens of communities. People who had never thought twice about where a shell ended up after dinner now understood that it could have a second life beneath the water. Scientists continued studying the Florida reefs long after the first shells had been placed on the seafloor. What they found, year after year, was encouraging. The reefs kept growing. Fish populations kept increasing. Water quality kept improving. The system that nature had built on top of those simple discarded shells was still expanding and strengthening with every passing season. Perhaps the most important lesson from the whole project had nothing to do with science or technology. It had to do with the way humans think about waste and about nature. For a long time, people had believed that restoring a damaged ecosystem required complicated machines, expensive chemicals, or decades of hard engineering work. The Florida Oyster Project proved something different. Sometimes the best tool for healing nature is nature itself. Sometimes the best thing humans can do is give natural systems a small boost and then step back and let life do what life has always done: grow, adapt, and rebuild. 500,000 tons of shells, millions of oysters, a cleaner Gulf, a stronger coastline, a thriving ecosystem. All of it began with something that used to be called garbage. And it is a reminder that even the smallest action, done with care and patience, can lead to something far greater than anyone ever imagined. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.